I bought an old suitcase at an auction for $10, but when I opened it, I discovered a false bottom. Under it, an envelope and $2 million in cash. When I read the note, I couldn't breathe. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I've always been the kind of woman who finds treasure in other people's discards. Not metaphorically. I mean it literally. Every Saturday morning, while my neighbors slept in or scrolled through their phones, I was up at 6, thermos of coffee in hand, driving to estate sales, flea markets, and auction houses scattered across central Ohio. My name is Carol Merritt. I'm 43 years old, a middle school art teacher, divorced for 6 years, and the proud owner of a 2-bedroom house that my ex-husband once called a museum of other people's junk. I called it home. My life before that Saturday in October was ordinary in the best possible way. I had my routines, my small pleasures, my students who sometimes surprised me with their talent, and my cat, Biscuit, who never surprised me at all. I paid my bills on time, kept a modest savings account, and told myself that was enough. Most days, I believed it. The auction was held at Hargrove & Sons, a mid-sized house on the east side of Columbus that specialized in estate liquidations. I had been there a dozen times before. The lots were displayed on long, folding tables, chipped china, old lamps, boxes of paperbacks, furniture that smelled of other people's lives. I wasn't looking for anything in particular that morning. That's usually when you find the most interesting things. The suitcase was sitting alone on a table near the back wall, slightly apart from the other items, as if even the auctioneers weren't quite sure what to make of it. It was a hard-shell Samsonite from the 1972, olive green with brass-tone latches that had gone slightly orange with age. The leather handle was cracked, but intact. There was a faded luggage tag attached. No name visible, just a smear where ink had once been. I ran my fingers along the seam. It was solid, heavy, but not unusually so. I liked it immediately. I paid $10 for it. The young man at the registration table barely looked up when he processed my card. Here is where I should have paid more attention. As I carried the suitcase toward the exit, I noticed a man standing near the entrance. He was in his mid-40s, heavy-set, wearing a canvas jacket that was too warm for the weather. He was watching me, not casually, the way you glance at someone carrying something, but with a fixed, deliberate attention that made the back of my neck prickle. When our eyes met, he looked away. I told myself I was being oversensitive. I picked up my pace and walked to my car. I loaded the suitcase into my trunk and drove home through quiet streets, the morning light thin and gray over the highway. Biscuit was waiting on the windowsill. I made a second cup of coffee and set the suitcase on my kitchen table. The latches opened smoothly, which surprised me. Inside, nothing. The interior was clean. Suspiciously clean, actually, for a suitcase that old. No lint, no smell of mothballs, no forgotten receipt or crumpled tissue. Just a flat expanse of olive green fabric lining and 4 walls of hard plastic shell. I pressed the lining with my palm. It gave slightly, and then I felt it. A ridge, a seam that didn't belong. My heart did something strange. Not a leap exactly, more like a hesitation. I found a butter knife in the kitchen drawer and worked it along the edge of the lining. It took 4 minutes. The false bottom lifted out in one piece. A thin panel of cardboard covered in fabric, precisely fitted, the work of someone patient and deliberate. Beneath it, a manila envelope sealed with packing tape, and underneath the envelope, bundled in rubber bands so old they had begun to crack, more cash than I had ever seen in one place in my entire life. I stood in my kitchen in my Saturday morning socks, the cat watching me from the counter, and stared at $2 million in $100 bills. Then I read the note inside the envelope, and I stopped breathing entirely. The note was short, 6 sentences, written in the careful, slightly trembling handwriting of someone old. If you found this, you earned it. I spent 40 years earning it too. My son knows it existed. He must never find it. He is not who he pretends to be. God bless you, whoever you are. I read it 3 times. Then I sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs had simply stopped working. I sat on that floor for a long time. Biscuit eventually came and pressed his head against my knee, which is the closest he ever came to expressing concern. I scratched his ears without really feeling it. My coffee went cold on the table above me. The practical part of my brain, the part that grades papers and files tax returns and remembers to rotate her tires, eventually took over. I got up, closed the suitcase, latched it, and carried it to my bedroom closet. I pushed it behind a row of winter coats, then stood there staring at the coats for a moment as if they might offer some kind of guidance. They did not. I went back to the kitchen and I did what any rational person would do in that situation. I made a list, not of what I wanted to do with the money, not yet. I made a list of what I actually knew and what I didn't know, and what those 2 things meant for my immediate safety. What I knew, I had purchased a suitcase at a public auction for $10. Inside that suitcase was a false bottom containing $2 million in cash and a handwritten note. The note suggested the money had been hidden deliberately by its owner, an elderly person, based on the handwriting, and that this person had a son who knew the money existed. The note also suggested that the son was dangerous or at least untrustworthy. In some way, the writer couldn't or wouldn't specify. What I didn't know, who had owned the suitcase, whose estate had been liquidated, whether the money was legal, whether the son knew the suitcase had been sold at auction, and if so, whether he knew to whom, and then there was the man in the canvas jacket. I went back over that moment carefully, the way you replay a near accident on the highway, looking for the details you missed in real time. He had been standing near the entrance. He had been watching me specifically. Not the suitcase, me. He had looked away when I noticed him. He had not approached me. He had not followed me. Or at least, I hadn't noticed him following me, which was not the same thing at all. Could he have been the son? The thought sat in my stomach like a stone. I am not a reckless woman. I am not a woman who romanticizes danger or tells herself that rules don't apply to her. I've watched enough true crime to know exactly how these stories end when the finder decides to keep everything quiet and handle it alone. But I am also not a woman who panics. And sitting there at my kitchen table, looking at my handwritten list, I felt something clarify inside me. The money was not stolen from anyone living. The note made that clear. Whoever had written it had put it there intentionally for whoever found it. That was a gift. And the person most determined to take that gift from me was, by the writer's own account, someone who should not have it. That was the moment I stopped being afraid and started being careful. First step, information. I needed to know whose estate had generated that auction. Hargrove and Sons would have records. Estate auctions are matters of public record in Ohio. The probate filings, the executor's name, the deceased's identity. I could find this without drawing attention if I was thoughtful about it. Second step, legal counsel. Not tomorrow, not next week. Soon. Before I did anything else. I needed to understand my position. A lawyer. Someone I didn't already know. Someone with no connection to my life. Attorney-client privilege would protect me while I figured out exactly what I was holding and what my rights were. Third step, the money itself. I was not going to touch it. Not a dollar. Not yet. It needed to stay exactly where it was, documented, photographed, untouched, until I understood what I was dealing with. I photographed every bundle of bills with my phone. I photographed the note. I photographed the false bottom panel, the interior of the suitcase, the exterior, and the auction receipt that was still in my jacket pocket. Then I uploaded everything to a cloud account I created fresh that afternoon, using a name that was not my own, on a device connected to my neighbor's Wi-Fi network with her permission. She gave me the password years ago for emergencies, and this, I decided quietly, qualified. I put the phone down. I looked at Biscuit. "We're going to be okay," I told him. He blinked at me with magnificent indifference. I opened my laptop and began searching Ohio probate records. The estate, it turned out, had belonged to a woman named Dorothy Ellison, age 81, of Gahanna, Ohio. She had died 8 weeks earlier. Her executor was listed as her son, Richard Ellison, age 47, of Columbus. I sat with that name for a long moment. Then I opened a new search tab and typed Richard Ellison, Columbus, Ohio. What came back made me close the laptop and sit very still in my quiet kitchen. Richard Ellison had been investigated, not charged, investigated, by the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office 4 years ago. The case involved financial elder abuse. The alleged victim had been his own mother. Dorothy Ellison had known exactly what she was hiding from, and she had known exactly who she was hiding it from. Monday morning, I called in a personal day, the first I'd taken in 2 years, and drove across town to a law office I'd found through the Ohio State Bar's referral service. I specifically chose someone I had no prior connection to, a woman named Patricia Okafor, a solo practitioner who specialized in probate disputes and civil litigation. Her office was on the 3rd floor of a beige building near Easton, decorated with framed diplomas and a single potted fern that looked like it had seen things. I told Patricia everything. I showed her the photographs on my phone. I watched her face carefully as she looked through them, and I noticed the exact moment she shifted from professional courtesy to genuine attention. It happened when she got to the image of the note. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down and looked at me steadily. "The auction was a legal transaction," she said. "You purchased the suitcase as is, contents unknown, through a licensed estate liquidation house. Under Ohio law, you have a defensible claim to the contents." "Defensible," I said, "not certain." "Nothing in law is certain," she said, "but your position is stronger than you might think. The estate executor, this Richard Ellison, would have had to authorize the auction. He authorized the sale of that suitcase. He either didn't know the money was there, which is his problem, or he did know and authorized the sale anyway, which is an entirely different kind of problem for him. What if he claims the suitcase was sold by mistake?" Patricia folded her hands on her desk. "Then he has to prove it, and proving it means drawing attention to $2 million in cash that his elderly mother hid in a false bottom suitcase after he was investigated for financially abusing her." She let that sit for a moment. People in his position generally prefer not to invite that kind of scrutiny. I drove home with my head full of new information and a retainer agreement in my bag. Patricia had also advised me to document my physical security. Note any unusual vehicles near my house, any unexpected visitors, any contact from anyone associated with the Ellison estate. She said it calmly, in the tone of someone describing a routine precaution, but I heard the subtext clearly. Be careful. I had been home for perhaps 40 minutes when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Is this Carol Merritt? A man's voice. Measured, pleasant, entirely too smooth. Who's calling? My name is Richard Ellison. I believe you purchased an item at the Hargrove auction this past Saturday, an olive green suitcase. The floor seemed to tilt slightly under my feet. I kept my voice completely even. I buy a lot of things at auctions, I said. What's your interest in it? That suitcase belonged to my late mother, he said. I believe it may have been included in the auction by administrative error. I'm hoping we can resolve this quietly between the two of us. I'd like to come by and collect it, and of course, compensate you for your inconvenience. Of course. That word told me everything. The offer to compensate. The phrase resolve this quietly. The assumption that I would be eager to make this easy for him. I appreciate the call, I said pleasantly. I'll need to look into this. Can I reach you at this number? He gave me a second number, a cell phone, he said, and hung up. I immediately texted both numbers to Patricia. Then I sat down and tried to stop my hands from shaking. He had found me in less than 48 hours. That meant he had either been at the auction, the man in the canvas jacket, or he had someone there on his behalf who had recorded the buyer information. Either way, he had access to my name and my phone number. What else did he have? I went to my front window and looked out at the street. A dark blue pickup truck was parked 2 houses down on the opposite side. I had never seen it before. As I watched, I realized I couldn't see inside the cab. The windows were too tinted for that. But the truck was running. I could see the faint shimmer of exhaust in the cold air. I photographed it from behind the curtain. License plate Ohio, partial read. First 3 characters, FKD. Then I did something I hadn't planned to do until later in the week. I got in my car, drove back to Hargrove and Sons, and asked to speak with the manager. His name was Dale Hargrove, 60s, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, clearly a man who preferred straightforward transactions to complicated conversations. I showed him Dorothy Ellison's name and asked him who had authorized the inclusion of that suitcase in the auction. He pulled up the file. He frowned. That's interesting, he said, turning the screen slightly so I could see it. The executor, Ellison, sent us a comprehensive inventory list. That suitcase is on it. It was authorized. He looked up at me. Why? Just making sure my purchase is clean, I said. Do you mind if I get a copy of that authorization? He printed it for me without asking more questions. I thanked him and walked to my car, and it was only when I was sitting behind the wheel with the engine off that I allowed myself to feel what I was actually feeling. Richard Ellison had authorized the sale of that suitcase. He had signed off on it, which meant that either he genuinely didn't know about the false bottom, in which case the money was mine by every legal measure that mattered, or he had known and had made a catastrophic error and was now trying to undo it through back channels and quiet compensation rather than legal process, because legal process would expose him. I drove home a different route, checking my mirror more than I usually did. The blue truck was not behind me, but I knew this was not over. In fact, I understood now, with absolute clarity, that it had barely begun. Patricia moved faster than I expected. By Wednesday, she had filed a quiet but formal legal notice. Not a lawsuit, not yet, but a document that established on the record that I was the lawful purchaser of the suitcase and its contents, that the sale had been authorized by the estate executor, and that I had retained legal counsel. She sent a copy to Richard Ellison's address via certified mail. This does two things, she explained over the phone. It puts him on notice that you're not going to be handled informally, and it creates a paper trail that makes it very difficult for him to pursue any kind of claim without drawing official attention to the money itself. Will it make him angry? I asked. Yes, she said. Probably. She was right. It did. Thursday afternoon, I was in my classroom after school, straightening supply cabinets, when my phone buzzed with a text from the unknown number Richard had originally called from. We need to talk. I'm outside your school. I stopped moving. I looked at the text for a long moment. Then I called Patricia's office on the landline, left a message with her assistant, and called the school's main office to let them know I was expecting a visitor I did not want on school property. Then I walked to the front entrance. Richard Ellison was standing in the parking lot. He was heavy-set in his mid-40s, wearing a canvas jacket, the same man from the auction. He had been there himself that Saturday, watching me carry away his mother's secret. He was not alone. Standing slightly behind and to his left was a woman, younger, perhaps late 30s, sharp features, arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who has calculated every angle of a room before entering it. His wife. I would learn her name was Diane. I stopped at the top of the steps. I did not come down. "Mr. Ellison," I said. "My attorney has been in contact with your address. Any further communication should go through her." "I'm not here to communicate," he said. His pleasant telephone manner was entirely gone. "I'm here to give you the opportunity to make a smart decision before this becomes something neither of us wants." "Something neither of us wants," I repeated. "Like a legal proceeding that examines how your mother's estate was managed?" His jaw tightened. Diane, behind him, shifted her weight. "You have no idea what you're holding," Richard said. "That money doesn't belong to you. It was kept off the books for a reason, and those reasons didn't die with my mother. There are people, not me, who have an interest in seeing it returned. People who are not patient." I heard the shape of what he was implying. He was suggesting the money was connected to something dangerous, something beyond him, beyond his family. He wanted me to be afraid of a larger threat. It was a classic bluffing technique, and I recognized it because I had read Patricia's notes on intimidation tactics the night before, as if studying for an exam. "I'm going to count to 5, I said, "and if you haven't turned around and walked off this property, I'm calling the Columbus police and reporting that the executor of the Dorothy Ellison estate is trespassing at a middle school while verbally threatening a private citizen." I took out my phone. 1. Diane put her hand on Richard's arm. "This isn't finished," he said. 2, I said. They left. I went back inside and sat down in the hallway outside my classroom and shook quietly for about 10 minutes. One of my colleagues, Jenny Park, walked by and stopped when she saw my face. I told her I'd had an upsetting call from a family matter. She brought me a cup of tea from the teacher's lounge and didn't ask questions, which was exactly what I needed. That evening, I called Patricia and reported the encounter in full detail. She filed an addendum to the legal notice. She also, with my permission, contacted a former colleague who worked in the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office, not to initiate proceedings, but to quietly establish that the name Richard Ellison had come across her desk in a civil matter involving his late mother's estate. "Planting a flag," Patricia called it. "Is that ethical?" I asked. "It's a phone call between 2 attorneys who went to law school together," she said. "I mentioned a name. That's all." I trusted her. But after I hung up, the exhaustion hit me like a wall. Not just physical tiredness, the deep bone-level drain of sustained alertness, of spending 4 days constantly calculating, constantly watching, constantly managing my own fear. I called my school the next morning and arranged for a substitute for the following 2 days. I drove out to a small rental cabin I found online. Nothing fancy, $60 a night, an hour east of Columbus near a state park. No one knew I was going. I told no one. I spent Friday and Saturday walking trails through bare November trees, eating soup from a can warmed on a gas burner, and reading a novel I'd started in September and never finished. I did not check my legal email. I did not look at the photographs of the money. I gave myself 2 days to simply be a person who lived in the world rather than a person who was fighting for something in it. On Sunday morning, I drove home with steady hands and a quiet mind. The blue truck was not on my street. The house was exactly as I'd left it. Biscuit was waiting with a level of indignation about his food bowl that I found deeply comforting. I was ready for whatever came next. The offer arrived on Tuesday in the form of a formal letter on legal stationery from an attorney named Gerald Swick of Swick and Bauer LLP, a firm with a polished website and a downtown Columbus address. The letter was addressed to Patricia and CC'd to me. It proposed, in the careful language of people who want very much to avoid saying what they mean directly, that I return the suitcase and its contents in exchange for a payment of $50,000, described as consideration for the inconvenience of the transaction and framed as a good faith resolution. $50,000 against $2 million. Patricia called me the moment she received it. I could hear something underneath her professional tone, not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. "They think you need the money," she said. "Everyone needs $50,000, I said. "They think you need it badly enough to take this offer without doing the math." She paused. "The fact that they sent it through an attorney means they're trying to make this look clean. They want a paper trail that shows a voluntary settlement. And if I accept, they get the money back and a signed document saying I was happy with the deal." "Exactly. After which you would have very limited recourse if you later felt the settlement was made under duress." I had already known I wasn't going to accept it, but hearing Patricia lay it out so clearly, the structure of the manipulation, the assumption about my financial desperation, the way the offer was designed to close every door behind me, made something in my chest go very cold and very still. "Draft a response declining the offer," I said. "Keep it brief. Don't explain our reasoning." "Already started," she said. I put the phone down and went to make coffee, and I stood in my kitchen looking out the window at the backyard. Bare trees, dry leaves pressed against the fence, a cardinal on the feeder. And I thought about Dorothy Ellison, 81 years old, spending 40 years accumulating something, hiding it, protecting it from her own son, writing 6 sentences in trembling handwriting and hoping that whoever found it would be equal to the situation. Was I equal to it? I genuinely didn't know. But I intended to find out. The isolation of the previous weeks was starting to wear on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had been careful to keep this entirely to myself. No friends, no family, following Patricia's early advice to limit exposure. That was correct, legally. But I was beginning to feel the weight of carrying it alone. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from having a secret that is simultaneously the most important thing in your life and the thing you least want to explain to anyone. I thought about who I trusted. Actually trusted, not just liked. The answer was my sister, Renata. Renata was 50 years old, lived in Cincinnati, worked as an ER nurse, and had what I would describe as an industrial-grade tolerance for complicated situations. She had been through a contentious divorce of her own, navigated a medical malpractice case as a witness, and once talked me off the ledge of an impulsive decision to quit my job and move to Portland by asking me 17 questions in rapid succession until I answered my own question myself. She was not easily frightened. She was not a gossip. And she had, since our mother died 8 years ago, been the person I called when things were genuinely serious. I drove to Cincinnati on Saturday. I brought the full file, printed copies of the photographs, the note, the probate records, the legal filings, the letter from Swick and Bauer. I spread it all out on Renata's kitchen table while she made pasta, and I talked for 2 hours straight. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You've been carrying this alone for almost 3 weeks," she said. "Yes. And you've done everything right." "I think so." She looked at the photograph of the note. She read it again, slowly. Then she set it down and looked at me with the expression she reserves for things she considers non-negotiable. "You are not giving that money back to a man who financially abused his 81-year-old mother," she said. "That's not a legal opinion. That's just a fact." Something released in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding tight. We talked until midnight. Renata asked me the same 17-question style of interrogation she'd been doing since we were children, drilling down into every decision I'd made, every decision I was planning, every assumption I was operating on. She found 2 things I hadn't considered. First, whether Dorothy Ellison had any other surviving relatives who might have a claim, and second, whether the investigation 4 years ago had ever been closed or whether it was technically still open. Both were worth exploring. I called Patricia on Monday morning with both questions. She already had a partial answer to the second one. The investigation had been closed without charges, but the case file still existed, and the investigator who had handled it was still with the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. "Is there a way," I asked carefully, "to make sure that person knows the file might be relevant again?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Leave that with me," she said. I did. They came on a Wednesday evening, unannounced, while I was grading papers at my kitchen table. The doorbell rang at 6:47 p.m. I looked through the peephole and saw Richard and Diane Ellison standing on my front porch with a bottle of wine. A bottle of wine, as if they were neighbors stopping by for a casual visit, as if the previous 3 weeks had been some kind of misunderstanding between people who fundamentally liked each other. I opened the door but did not invite them in. "Carol," Richard said, and his voice had shifted again, back to the pleasant, controlled register of our first phone call, the one that had felt like oil on water. He had clearly rehearsed this. "We owe you an apology. The way we approached this, it wasn't right. We were grieving, and we didn't handle it well." He held out the wine. Diane smiled. It was a precise smile, measured to convey warmth without committing to it. I looked at them for a moment. I looked at the wine. I thought, who brings wine to someone they've been surveilling and threatening? People who have decided to try a different kind of pressure. "I appreciate you coming," I said, "but I should tell you up front that anything related to the estate needs to go through my attorney. That hasn't changed." "Of course," Diane said smoothly, stepping slightly forward. She had an air of practiced reasonableness, the kind that takes effort to maintain, visible in the small tensions around her eyes. "We're not here about legal matters. We wanted you to understand the full picture, some context that we think you deserve to have." This was the invitation to let them in, the suggestion that there was information I was missing, that I was acting without crucial facts, that if I only understood the complete story, I might make a different choice. It was elegantly constructed. I had to give them that. "What context?" I said. I did not move from the doorway. Richard's expression flickered, just briefly, just for a fraction of a second, before the pleasantness reasserted itself. He'd expected me to step back, to wave them inside, pour them a glass of their own wine, sit down across from them, and be a reasonable person. "Our mother," he said, "was not well in her final years. Cognitively, I mean. The money you found, it was accumulated over decades, yes. But in her last years, she made decisions that didn't reflect her real intentions. She hid things. She became paranoid. She wrote notes that don't accurately represent what actually happened between us." His voice had acquired a note of son. I believe that was genuine. A son's practiced sorrow. Whatever she wrote in that note, it was written by a woman who was frightened and confused, not by the mother we knew. There it was. The note discredited. Dorothy's competence questioned. The narrative reframed. "She sounds like she might have benefited from a capacity evaluation," I said pleasantly. "Did her estate attorneys conduct one before the will was probated?" Diane's smile went briefly rigid. "We're not trying to argue legal technicalities," she said. "We're trying to appeal to your compassion. Our mother left behind other family, grandchildren, people who loved her. That money represents her life's work. Surely you can understand why it matters to us." Grandchildren. Now there were grandchildren. I noted the appearance of new emotional leverage. "I understand that it matters to you," I said. "I genuinely do. But understanding why something matters to you doesn't change my legal position, and it doesn't change the fact that your mother signed off on the auction that included that suitcase. If you'd like to contest that in probate court, my attorney's contact information is on the legal notice you received." Richard's mask dropped. Not entirely, not theatrically, just a centimeter. A flattening around the eyes, a stiffening through the shoulders. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he said. And the pleasantness was gone from his voice entirely now. What was underneath it was quieter and less pleasant. "There are things about that money that you don't understand, things that could put you in a very uncomfortable position. We're trying to help you avoid that." "Are you threatening me again?" I said. "I want to make sure I characterize this accurately for my attorney." Diane put her hand firmly on Richard's arm, the same gesture as in the parking lot. A practiced gesture. She'd done this before, pulled him back from edges he'd moved toward too quickly. "We're not threatening anyone," she said with careful control. "We're simply suggesting that this situation is more complicated than it might appear. We hope you'll take some time to reconsider." She set the wine bottle down on the porch railing, as if leaving a gift, or a marker of some kind. "Good night, Carol." They walked back to their car. I watched them go. I noted the license plate, a different car than the pickup truck, a black sedan, Ohio plates, and photographed it through my front window after I closed the door. Then I sat down on my couch and let myself feel what I was actually feeling. Fear. Yes, real, physical fear. The kind that lives in the chest and makes breathing slightly shallower. Richard's final remark had been designed to do exactly that, to suggest there were dimensions to this situation that I couldn't fully see, risks I didn't understand, invisible pressures that could descend on me without warning. It was expert work in its way. Even knowing it was a manipulation tactic, I could feel the cold edge of it. But here is what I also felt. Underneath the fear, solid as bedrock, a fury that was entirely clean. Dorothy Ellison had hidden $2 million from her own son because she was afraid of him. She had been right to be afraid, and she had reached across her own death, through a butter knife and a false bottom, and handed what she'd built to a stranger she trusted more than her own family. I was not going to let him have it. I called Patricia and gave her a full account of the visit. She said she would be filing a harassment addendum to our existing legal record first thing Thursday morning. She also told me something she'd been waiting to confirm. The probate court had agreed to schedule a hearing on the legitimacy of the estate's auction authorization. We had a date, December 14th, 3 weeks away. I went back to my kitchen table and picked up the ungraded papers. I finished them by 10 o'clock. I fed Biscuit. I went to bed. I did not sleep particularly well. But in the morning, I got up and went to work, and when my students asked why I seemed tired, I told them I was working on a difficult project. "Is it hard?" one of them asked. "Yes," I said, "but I'm going to finish it." December 14th arrived gray and cold, the kind of Ohio morning that makes the world look like an old photograph of itself. I dressed carefully, dark navy blazer, pressed trousers, low heels, professional, composed, the clothes of someone who had decided long before she walked into the room how things were going to go. Patricia met me on the courthouse steps at 8:30. She was carrying a leather portfolio so full it barely closed. She looked, as always, completely unrattled. "They filed a competing motion," she told me as we walked, claiming the suitcase was included in the auction inventory in error, that the executor never intended for the contents to be transferred. "Can they prove that?" "They're going to try." She held the door for me. "But they have a problem." The courtroom was small, a probate hearing, not a trial, before a single magistrate named Judge Elaine Watkins. Richard and Diane were already seated on the opposite side. Gerald Swick, their attorney, sat between them. Richard had adopted an expression of patient sorrow. Diane's face was carefully neutral. They looked like people who had prepared for exactly this. What they were not prepared for was what Patricia had brought with her. The first 30 minutes were procedural. Both sides presenting their positions, the magistrate asking clarifying questions, Swick arguing that the suitcase's inclusion had been an administrative oversight and that the executor had never knowingly authorized the transfer of cash assets. Patricia listened to all of it without interrupting. When it was her turn, she stood up and did 3 things in sequence. First, she submitted the signed auction authorization form bearing Richard Ellison's signature. The one Dale Hargrove had printed for me that afternoon in November. Richard had personally approved every line item on the estate inventory list. The olive green Samsonite was item number 47, signed, dated, witnessed. Swick objected that the authorization had been made without full knowledge of the contents. Patricia nodded pleasantly and moved to the second thing. Second, she submitted Dorothy Ellison's medical records from the 2 years prior to her death, obtained through proper legal channels with the cooperation of Dorothy's primary care physician, who had been contacted by Patricia's office after Diane's claim that Dorothy had been cognitively impaired. The records showed no diagnosis of dementia, no cognitive evaluation indicating impairment, no notation of diminished capacity. Dorothy Ellison, at the time she had constructed that false bottom and written that note, had been a woman in full possession of her faculties. Richard's jaw moved slightly, a small, controlled motion that he stopped almost immediately. Third, Patricia submitted a certified copy of a document from the Franklin County Probate Court, Dorothy Ellison's original handwritten will amendment, filed 8 months before her death, in which she had explicitly instructed that all personal property be sold at public auction and that the proceeds of those sales be considered legally finalized at the point of sale. She had planned this. Dorothy had planned this. She hadn't just hidden the money. She had constructed a legal architecture around it, a path by which, if her son tried to reclaim it afterward, the reclaim would be impossible without reversing an authorization he himself had signed and contesting a will amendment she had filed while legally competent. The courtroom was very quiet. "Your Honor," Patricia said, "my client is the lawful purchaser of the item in question and its contents." The transfer was authorized by the executor, consistent with the decedent's clearly expressed intentions, and is not subject to recovery by the estate. We're asking the court to confirm title. Judge Watkins looked at Swick. "Counselor?" Swick leaned toward Richard and said something in a low voice. Richard's response was visible, a tightening around the mouth, a quick shake of the head. Diane, on his other side, put her hand flat on the table in what looked like a suppression of the urge to say something. Swick straightened. "Your Honor, we would request a continuance to review the newly submitted materials. You've had 3 weeks since the original legal notice," Judge Watkins said. Her voice was even, but not warm. "The materials submitted today are responsive to arguments your own client raised. Request denied." She looked down at the documents for a long moment. The room was completely still. I could hear the faint sound of traffic from outside. "The court finds in favor of the petitioner," she said. "Title to the purchased item and its contents is confirmed as belonging to Carol Merritt, purchaser of record. The estate's claim is dismissed." Richard Ellison stood up. "This is—" he began. "Mr. Ellison." Judge Watkins' voice dropped half a register. "You are welcome to discuss further legal options with your attorney. You are not welcome to continue speaking in my courtroom." She picked up her pen. "We're adjourned." I watched him. His hands were at his sides, and one of them, I noticed, was trembling slightly. Not with fear, but with the particular physical vibration of a man accustomed to getting what he wants, who has just discovered, in a room full of witnesses, that he will not be getting it today. Diane put her hand on his arm. A third time. The same gesture. But this time it didn't work. He shook her off, and for one unguarded moment I saw the truth of their dynamic. Not a couple strategizing together, but a woman trying to contain a man she was also afraid of. I thought of Dorothy. I picked up my bag and followed Patricia out of the courtroom. In the hallway, she shook my hand with both of hers. She was not a demonstrative woman, and the gesture told me more than congratulations would have. "She was smart," I said quietly. "Dorothy." "Extraordinarily," Patricia said. "She had a very good estate attorney." I looked back at the courtroom door for a moment. "I think she had more than that," I said. "I think she had 40 years of watching him very carefully." We walked out into the cold December morning. My breath came out in small clouds. The sky was the same flat gray as it had been at 8:30, but it looked different now. Everything did. The weeks that followed the hearing moved with a combination of practical intensity and quiet unreality. Patricia guided me through every step with the precision I had come to rely on completely. The first decision was the most significant: what to do with the money itself. $2 million in cash, sitting in a false-bottom suitcase in my bedroom closet, was both a legal asset and a practical liability. Patricia connected me with a financial crimes attorney named Marcus Webb, who specialized in exactly these situations: unreported cash of uncertain origin requiring proper legal handling. Marcus was a compact, methodical man in his late 50s who seemed to approach every problem as an exercise in orderly disassembly. He explained the process clearly. The cash would need to be reported to the IRS under specific statutes governing found property. Taxes would apply to a portion. The legal fees and filings would account for more. What remained after all obligations would be mine, clean and documented and entirely defensible. The number, after everything, was $1.4 million. I sat with that figure for a long time the day Marcus gave it to me. In my classroom, actually. He'd called during my lunch break, and I was sitting at my desk with half a sandwich in front of me and 32 ungraded book reports, and he told me I would net $1.4 million. And I said, "Thank you," and he said, "You're welcome," and we hung up. Then I ate my sandwich. Because what else do you do? The financial process took 8 weeks. Every step was documented, every form filed correctly, every dollar accounted for in the manner that removed any future vulnerability. Marcus filed everything. Patricia reviewed everything. I signed where they told me to sign. By the second week of February, the funds had been deposited into a new account at a bank I had not previously used, under advisement from both attorneys. As for Richard Ellison, the dismissal of his estate claim was not his only problem. The documentation Patricia had submitted, particularly the medical records and the will amendment, had been reviewed by people beyond the magistrate. The Franklin County Prosecutor's Office, which had previously closed an investigation into Richard's handling of Dorothy's finances, quietly reopened it. Patricia had nothing to do with this, officially. The case file had simply been flagged for review following the probate hearing, as sometimes happens when new documents become part of the court record. Patricia told me this over coffee in late January with the same neutral tone she applied to everything. I received it the same way. Neither of us said anything further about it. What I did do, I drove to Gahanna one afternoon in February and found the street where Dorothy Ellison had lived for 40 years. It was a modest house on a quiet block. Brick, a covered porch, a garden bed that was bare in winter, but would be something in spring. I sat in my car outside it for about 10 minutes. I didn't know what I expected to feel. What I actually felt was something I can only describe as a kind of gratitude that moved in both directions, mine toward her, and something I imagined in return, an acknowledgement, a completed circuit. I drove away. The final thing that happened in February was smaller, but significant to me personally. I received a letter from Hargrove and Sons, from Dale Hargrove himself, the manager who had printed the authorization form for me back in November. He had heard, apparently through the probate court's public record, how the case had resolved. The letter was brief and professional, but the last sentence said, "I'm glad the right person opened that suitcase." I kept the letter. I put it in the same folder as Dorothy's note. What did I do with $1.4 million? I was practical about it because I'm a practical person, and because Dorothy had been a practical person, and it seemed like the right kind of tribute. I paid off my mortgage. I established a college fund for Renata's 2 kids, who were 12 and 15 and had no idea any of this had happened. I funded a small arts program grant at my school, anonymous because I wanted the money to go to materials and not to any conversation about where it came from. The rest I invested carefully with help from a financial advisor Patricia recommended. I went back to teaching on a Monday morning in February and stood in front of my classroom and asked my students to take out their sketchbooks. One of them, a girl named Maya who had been struggling all semester, held up a drawing she'd done over the weekend. It was a bird in a cage with the door open. "I wasn't going to show anyone," she said, "but it felt important." "Things that feel important usually are," I told her. I meant it. Spring came early that year, or at least it felt that way. In my own backyard, I built raised garden beds along the south fence and planted tomatoes, herbs, and zinnias. I did it on a Saturday morning with the radio on, Biscuit watching from the back step with his perpetual expression of mild contempt. It was the first Saturday in 6 months I hadn't woken up calculating something. My life settled into a shape I hadn't anticipated, recognizably my own, just with more room in it. The mortgage being gone changed something I hadn't fully registered as a weight until it was lifted, like discovering a sound you'd been filtering out for so long you'd stopped hearing it, and then noticing the silence. I took a week in July and went to see the Oregon coast. Gray beaches, clam chowder, 2 novels in 4 days, genuinely unhurried for the first time in a long time. Renata came to Columbus in May, and we spent a weekend going through our mother's old photographs, a project we'd been avoiding for 8 years. We laughed a lot. We cried a little. We made a plan to go to Vermont the following summer. Something about what I'd been through had clarified what actually mattered. Renata was at the top of that list. My students that spring produced the best art I'd seen in my classroom in years. Maya, the girl who had been struggling all semester, won a regional competition in April. I sat in the 3rd row and watched her accept a ribbon with the slightly dazed expression of someone who hasn't yet caught up to their own good fortune. I understood exactly how that felt. As for Richard and Diane, Patricia mentioned in April that the prosecutor's office had filed charges against Richard for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Transfers out of Dorothy's accounts in her final 18 months, withdrawn just below reporting thresholds. He'd been doing it for years. Dorothy had known. She'd hidden what she could, and when she couldn't protect anymore, she'd put it in a suitcase and hoped for a stranger. The trial was scheduled for autumn. Richard had gone through 3 attorneys by summer. Swick and Bauer had withdrawn entirely. In June, Diane moved out. I thought about her occasionally. The way she'd gripped his arm 3 times, each time slightly differently, the last time not working at all. I had no warmth for her. But some people are trapped by people like Richard Ellison. I hoped she got out. In August, I went to an estate sale in Upper Arlington. Saturday morning, thermos of coffee, comfortable shoes, a road atlas for $12, a botanical print for $8, no hidden cash, no false bottoms, just 2 nice things waiting to find a new home. Biscuit was on the windowsill when I got back. The garden was full. The mortgage was paid. Some things are exactly what they appear to be. And after everything, that felt like the most extraordinary thing of all.